Hi guys! So, we are continuing our journey through some of the classical spiritual disciplines this week. I think this will be week 5. You would have had Beanie chatting about worship last week. Sure, that was a great time. Our topic today is service. And I want to try and kind of thread the needle between two parts of a message today. Firstly, looking at the classical discipline of service, as we have done with other disciplines already. But I also want to take the opportunity to talk about something that has been a big part of my own formational journey and that has shaped a lot of my own thinking about how we do church from the start. And that is, what should it feel like when we serve in church? So obviously service can be done in all aspects of life. I want to sort of zero in on this one question of what does it look like when we serve in church? How do we lead teams? How do we organize ourselves? How do we disciple each other and recognize like the formational part of service in a church context without slipping into a more mechanical approach? So let's jump into the discipline as a whole, look at it in a broad sense, and then we'll zero in on that last bit later. As we've moved from topic to topic, I'm finding it helpful to think about the disciplines in terms of what characteristic of the flesh does that discipline keep in check. And so when we think about like fasting, we say, well, that keeps in check human desire. And when we looked at confession a couple of weeks ago, say, well, that keeps in check the isolating impact of sin. And I think when we think about service, we can think about it in terms of how does it keep our pride in check? Or stated more positively, a discipline that nurtures humility in our lives. So that kind of big framing look at what is it that we're hoping service is going to do for us. Richard Foster, in the book, he says, "We do not need to go through life faintly hoping that someday humility may fall upon our heads. Of all the classical spiritual disciplines, service is the most conducive to the growth of humility. When we set out on a consciously chosen path of action that accents the good of others and is for the most part a hidden work, a deep change occurs in our spirits. Nothing disciplines the inordinate desires of the flesh like service, and nothing transforms the desires of the flesh like serving in hiddenness." Humility is one of those fragile concepts where if you think you've got it, you don't have it anymore. And I think that's what he's talking about. You can be inclined to say, well, I can't just become more humble because then I won't be humble anymore. If I think I'm humble, then I'm not humble. So do we just sit here and wait for humility to kind of drop on us? And saying, no, service is the pathway towards true humility, particularly hidden service. Incidentally, I started reading another book this week, work-related. It's got a terrible name. It's called How to Win Friends and Influence People. I'm sure at least one of you has probably read it. I didn't realize how old this book was. It's from 1936, the first edition. And I had a quick look online. It's been ranked as the 7th most influential book in American history. It's sold 30 million copies. So it's got some traction. And the only reason I share those stats is even in the first chapter, it makes some fascinating comments about human nature. I'll just read 2 short sentences here. It says, Dr. Dewey said the deepest urge in human nature is the desire to feel important. And he goes on to say, it's almost as deep, almost as imperious as the desire for food or sleep. It's what Freud calls the desire to be great and what Dewey calls the desire to be important. Talking about the inclination of the human heart to be proud, want to be important, to be seen as important. Jesus experienced the temptation of pride too. the devil offered him a throne if he would bow down and worship him. In Matthew 4 verse 8 says, again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give to you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. I had to laugh going through this. I'm so used to reading books for the kids and trying to do the voices, but then you get to this, I'm like, oh, how do I do the voice of the devil? Anyway, so that's just one example. The devil offered Jesus a throne. There was an opportunity for Jesus to put himself forward there for the grasp of power. After the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in John 6, it says, after the people saw the sign that Jesus performed, they began to say to each other, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. We might be tempted to overlook these two anecdotes because we know how the story ends, but Jesus was fully man and his flesh would surely have been piqued by these opportunities to make much of himself, to feel important, to be great. Instead, Jesus did the will of the Father, and he redefined leadership in the process. You know, Roman culture celebrated power and the subjugation of the weak. Jesus, without renouncing his own authority, chose instead to serve the weak and the outcast. Matthew 20, instead, whoever wants to become great among you, this is Jesus talking, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The idea of servant leadership is actually quite familiar in theory to us presently. It's the basis upon which we elect officials every year. But we also know that the real outworking of those elected officials doesn't come close to matching up the theory. But when Jesus said this back in the day, in Roman times, this was incredible. There was no framework to understand a claim like this from someone who was a leader. One of the best known stories of Jesus' radical upending of hierarchy is the story of his washing the disciples' feet before the Passover meal. And the final portion of that text reads, very truly I tell you, and this is again Jesus talking, no servant is greater than his master. So talking about how the disciples should behave in relation to how Jesus has behaved. No, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So that's a specific injunction from Jesus to say, look, I have served you in the most profound way possible, being the lowest among you. You need to do the same for each other and you'll be blessed. So at this point we might say we serve because Jesus served and we're on a journey to become more like Jesus. But I think, and you probably realize, it goes deeper than that. Matthew 5 might be ringing in your ears. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That humility, that poverty of spirit is actually the entry point into gospel living. It's how we live like Jesus has called us to live. If we have pride, we reject meekness as weakness. I'm just going through the Beatitudes. Pride has no time for mercy. Why would you be merciful? Pride has no need for an all-consuming hunger and thirst for righteousness. Pride says, well, I'm doing okay. I'm doing pretty well. I don't need to pursue righteousness with any sort of depth of intent. And it has no reason for peacemaking. There's no humility. Just wanted to share a kind of story out of by a guy called William Law, writing many years ago. Instead, he talks about humility, and he says, if we want humility, we must condescend to the weaknesses and the infirmities of our fellow creatures, covering their frailties. He's just talking about what service looks like. We must love their excellencies, encourage their virtues, relieve their wants, rejoice in their prosperities, and compassionate in their distress. Receive their friendship, that can be service as well, overlook unkindness, forgive their malice, and be a servant of servants, and condescend to the lowest officers, to the lowest of mankind. The result then of this daily discipline of the flesh will be the rise of the grace of humility. It will slip upon us unawares. Though we do not sense its presence, we are aware of a fresh zest and exhilaration for living. We wonder at the new sense of confidence that marks our activities. Although the demands of life are as great as ever, we live with a new sense of unhurried peace. I think we all want that. We wonder how we can achieve it. Humility opens the door to a new way of life. Jesus rejected the opportunities to indulge his pride because he was living with a different mission in mind. And in the same way, pride can be a stumbling block in front of our own efforts to become more like Jesus, to become part of his kingdom, and then to join him on that divine mission that has been set before us. How could I say with any real conviction, repent and be saved, if my own hope is placed in my strength and my achievements and my own ability to direct my course in life and my own ability to keep myself secure? Thinking practically about service, I was just kind of thinking back about moments where we've had an opportunity to sort of quite intentionally go and serve people in the past. And I was thinking about, as a teenager, we spent a week digging vegetable gardens in a rural settlement in South Africa among an African community that I had no other contact with, our paths would never cross. And instead then of just seeing that group as the general them, as we might drive past on the highway, that's where those people live, I got to know the names of each homeowner. We played with their kids and we spent a couple of hours in their garden, in their home, doing the work. And in that way, the service exposed my own biases. As I watched moms discipline their kids, clean their homes, cook, and I saw kids just do normal dumb kid stuff, I realized how alike my family was to theirs. Last year we spent a couple of months helping out at the breakfast program in one of the local schools. We've only been in town for a couple of years, and I already had a kind of catalogue of biases about that particular school. But we started to getting to know the kids week after week, and I realized, one of the kids was super into Rubik's Cubes, and we chatted about that quite a lot, just like my nephew who lives in Seattle. And some of the kids were really timid. School's got a reputation for being a bit hardcore. Others had that classic, insecure, too cool to engage thing. That's exactly like some of the guys that I was at school with on the other side of the world. Service dignifies the people we serve. It exposes our own pride and our own biases that you didn't even realize you have, or have crept upon you without you kind of recognizing it. It helps us understand how much God loves people, just like he loves us. So we'll get a bit more practical in the questions, and I don't want to rush past this, but I do want to get to this second part of this topic of service and look at serving in the church. So I've had a number of experiences in church communities in the past where I felt like senior leaders have forgotten that not only are they pastoring the people we're trying to reach as a church, but they're also supposed to be pastoring the people closest to them in staff teams and volunteer teams. And the result is this kind of unhinged ambition, right? To the ends of the earth, we want to go, we want to reach people. But ultimately, it's fatally flawed. Because if you reach people with the good news of Jesus, and you welcome them in, and then you engage them in the mission, only for them to discover that actually the leader's a bit of a jerk, and discipleship ended at the membership class, and now you're just part of the team helping to accomplish the empire building exercise, it's only a matter of time before people become disillusioned. And then after a while, catastrophe strikes and you have a crisis of leadership and a loss of trust and breaking of relationships. We can't separate service and staffing and volunteerism from discipleship. How we lead teams of people matters, right? What it feels like to be in that volunteer team when you're working out your service discipline matters. And it's, I think, more important to disciple the people who are closest to the action than it is even to prioritize the people that we're trying to reach. In the early 2000s, it was quite popular for the church to invite in business leaders to share their leadership learnings so that we could build more efficient, more scalable, kind of impactful churches. There was a sense of, I think we slipped into a bit of a sacred and secular divide about how church works. Because the thing is, discipleship isn't actually that efficient. There's always a quicker way of doing something. Churches aren't profit-driven. And if we take our mission seriously as a church, and we think about the eternal nature of things, then there's nothing more, there's nothing valuable outside of discipleship. We can pull off a big event, but if we burn out the volunteer team in the process, then it's actually like a net loss for the kingdom. We could maybe make it more personal, like we can grow Valley Kids, we can do a whole lot of stuff there, but if the leadership of that team is heavy-handed and there's no grace for someone who has a crisis at work or needs a bit of time at home to focus on home base, that will lead to all sorts of unholy team dynamics and the loss of trust. People will become skeptical that you actually mean what you say as we preach and as we hold to the values of the gospel. If they don't see it up close in how we lead and how we operate as a group, we'll start to not believe that it's true, or certainly not held with any real conviction. What I've noticed about this thing is that it builds over time. People start out well-intentioned, righteous motives, want to join the mission of God, but I think over years, maybe the pursuit of success and prestige, that desire to be great, mixed with some letdowns and disappointments, seems to lead to an unhealthy culture of heavy-handed, merciless people management instead of discipleship. And we've got to do better. We've got to be slow to speak, quicker to listen. We've got to recognize the journey each of us are on, and we've got to not let our ambition outrun the capacity of our church. So I know that's all a bit of a tangent, but yeah, it's something we haven't really had the time to engage as a team. I bring it up when I can, but it's been a big part of my own story, and I wanted to get it out there. So I won't be here for this discussion round. Dave and Irene have kindly offered to host, so I encourage you, please work through the questions, come well prepared to share, and everyone contributes, it becomes a far richer experience. I'm sure if you do that, it'll be a fruitful experience. So much love, look forward to seeing you all soon, and God bless.